About to get started, everyone. Good evening. I invite you to find your seat. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas a todos. Qué bendición estar aquí en este campus, juntos por esta ocasión. Me llamo Jennifer Owens Jofre y yo soy una profesora asistente en el Departamento de Estudios Teológicos aquí en la Universidad de Loyola, Marymount. Antes de empezar con nuestro programa formal, me gustaría reconocer la tierra en que nos encontramos. As part of Loyola Marymount's recognition of our history, location, and relationship to the indigenous communities of Los Angeles, we acknowledge the Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tolangba, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands, and the presence of LMU on this traditional, ancestral, and unceded land. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live, study, create, and be in this place. We recognize that the Jewish high holidays begin tonight with Rosh Hashanah. Blessings to our Jewish colleagues for the new year. En este evento bilingüe hay interpretación disponible. Mil gracias a María Cristina Méndez y Estela Sandoval por ofrecerla. Tenemos instrucciones en nuestros programas. Solo necesitan llamar el número 339-207-7633. Si participan en la NEA, solo necesitan usar la función de interpretación. Y si participa en persona, puede enviar preguntas en fechas en este momento. Si participa en línea, solicitará que envíe sus preguntas en el chat después los comentarios de nuestro panel. La iniciativa de Teología y Pastoral Latina de la Universidad de Loyola Marymount es un proyecto conjunto de nuestro Departamento de Estudios Teológicos y el Centro para la Religión y la Espiritualidad. Surgió de una necesidad sentida de evaluar y responder a la gran población de católicos hispanos en los Estados Unidos. Como universidad católica en la arquidiócesis católica más grande del país, esta universidad está en una posición única para recopilar datos y reunir recursos que ayudarán a preparar a los católicos latinos para el liderazgo y el servicio en la iglesia. A medida que la población católica hispana continúa creciendo, la Universidad de Loyola Marymount busca crecer en la capacidad de servir verdaderamente a esta importante comunidad en el cuerpo de Cristo. The LLTM offers our gratitude to our co-sponsors in Catholic Studies, the Center for Nation Spirituality, the Center for Religion and Spirituality, Chicano Latino Student Services, the CSJ Center for Reconciliation and Justice, Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, Department of Theological Studies, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Division of Student Affairs, the graduate students of LMU who are staffing a voter registration table just now, should you like to register to vote tonight, the LMU Jesuit community, LMU School of Education, Mission and Ministry, the Office of the President, the Office of the Provost, the Religious of the Sacred Heart of Mary, and the T. Marie Tilton Chair in Catholic Theology. Dr. Elisa Rodriguez is professor of Chicana O and Latina O Studies at LMU and co-author of Funny Looking, Humor, Queer Latina O Camp, and Ugly Betty. She is the editor of Stunned into Being, Essays on the Poetry of Lorna D. Cervantes, and co-editor of The Unmaking of Latina O Citizenship, Culture, Politics, and Aesthetics. Her latest book project, Style, Aesthetics, and the Body, Chicana Cultural Production and the Making of Latinidad, examines the way style and aesthetics work on the body to create individual and collective forms of subjectivity, paying particular attention to the way Chicana cultural production works to articulate a critical, solidarity-driven Latinidad. Dr. Rodriguez currently serves as Associate Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts. Con mucho gusto, les presento Doctora Elisa Rodriguez.
So I'm going to present a bilingual introduction moving between English and Spanish. I grew up on the border of San Diego and Tijuana, and this is a very rare and treasured opportunity for me to move back and forth between my two mother tongues. Voy a estar haciendo una introducción bilingüe porque yo crecí en la frontera de Tijuana y San Diego y esta es una oportunidad muy rara y también muy especial en poder hablarles en ambos idiomas maternas para mí. Welcome and thank you for being together with us tonight, students, faculty, staff, and members of the larger Catholic community here in Southern California. Bienvenidos y gracias a todos por estar con nosotros esta noche. Me alegro que están aquí nuestros estudiantes y colegas junto con la comunidad católica del sur de California. Tonight's topic, immigration, disinformation, and faith, why getting this issue right matters to people of goodwill, could not be more timely or important during the final weeks before the presidential election next month. Disinformation is not simply incorrect. It is designed to mislead. We've all heard the line about cats and dogs being eaten by immigrants in Ohio. And while we can roll our eyes at the absurdity of the lie, it nonetheless is something we're still talking about weeks later. More serious is the disinformation about non-citizens voting, casting doubt on the integrity of the entire election, and it ultimately threatens our democracy. We should be on our guard about disinformation, both outlandish and apparently reasonable, because of the destructive way it links up and joins an already existing racist fable about immigration to mobilize oppressive and racist structures. It evokes familiar, hateful stereotypes and invokes their power. El tema de nuestra conversación, inmigración, desinformación y fe, la importancia de una buena comprensión para la gente de buena voluntad, es sumamente oportuno durante estas semanas antes de la elección presidencial. Lo malo de la desinformación no es que los datos o hechos son incorrectos, sino que la desinformación es engañosa. Ya todos hemos oído lo que dijo Trump sobre los gatos y los perros que los inmigrantes en Ohio se están comiendo. Y nosotros podemos poner los ojos en blanco. Sin embargo, todos estamos hablando de este comentario por la manera destructiva en que hace conexiones con las fábulas racistas sobre los inmigrantes. Evoca los estereotipos odiosos e invoca el poder que tienen. Más serio es la desinformación sobre las personas que no son ciudadanos que están votando. pone en duda la integridad de las elecciones y abre camino a la destrucción de nuestra democracia. Debemos estar atentos a la desinformación absurda y también la desinformación que parece ser razonable, porque moviliza a las estructuras opresivas y racistas. As educators grounded in mission, we're committed to the transformative power of Jesuit education that includes teaching our students to be in solidarity with others and to be engaged in the world as contemplatives in action. Getting it right, both in our understanding and in our actions, has enormous implications for us, for our friends and neighbors, and for asserting human dignity in the face of so much dehumanization. Como educadoras basadas en la misión de LMU, comprometidas al poder transformativa de una educación jesuita, que incluye enseñar a nuestros estudiantes a estar en solidaridad con otros y mantenerse como contemplativos en acción en el mundo. Getting it right quiere decir a la misma vez tener una buena tendencia y también hacer la cosa correcta. Tiene implicaciones enormes para nuestras amigas y vecinas, para la afirmación de la dignidad en la cara de tanta deshumanización. Thank you again for being here tonight, and thank you to the members of the LMU community who brought this topic to us in these critical weeks before the election. Gracias otra vez por estar aquí con nosotros, y gracias también a los miembros de la comunidad de LMU por traernos este tema tan importante en este momento antes de la elección.
This handout on immigration and disinformation is available to you if you are present in the room. Y está disponible también en el chat. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Ruben Martinez, our moderator this evening, who is a writer, teacher, and performer who holds the Fletcher Jones Chair in Literature and Writing here at Loyola Marymount and serves the English, Chicano and Latino Studies and Journalism departments. He is the author of several books, including Desert America, Our Journey Across Our Most Divided Landscape, and Crossing Over, A Mexican Family on the Migrant Trail. He is also the co-creator of Little Central America, 1984, a theatrical performance about the lives and times of the sanctuary movement, which has been staged at sites of major Central American communities like Los Angeles, Houston, Washington, D.C., and in December of 2024, the San Francisco Bay Area. The son and grandson of immigrants from El Salvador and Mexico, who has traveled and lived across Latin America as well as the United States, he considers himself a native of the borderlands. Welcome.
Okay, this is on, correct? Can all hear me? So in a Latinx or Latin American event that is in the evening, we always begin by a call and response. I'm going to say something and you are going to say it in response with a lot of chutzpah. Buenas noches. And it is a good night, holy night for the calendar of our Jewish brothers and sisters. It is also a dark night of the American soul. We know this. And it is my great pleasure to introduce you to the panel and to guide us into conversation, which you all will be have the opportunity to participate in as well. Shortly, there will be cards handed out where you can write down your questions, and we will proceed in that fashion. So let me introduce you to the panel. I will begin by introducing my esteemed colleague, Dr. Brett Hoover, and he'll come up as I introduce him, who is professor of practical theology in the Department of Theological Studies and the author of, and I get to actually have a prompt here, I get to plug the book because Brett probably would not. He is the author of Immigration and Faith, Cultural, Biblical, and Theological Narratives, which is a wonderful resource for our community and for our talk tonight, really, a guidepost for us tonight. He teaches a class here at LMU on migration and the border that combines history, sociology, ethics, and theology. Before entering academia, he worked in pastoral ministry with immigrants for 2 decades. Welcome, Dr. Hoover. Maria Barragan, ella, joined LMU as the director of the Undocumented Student Support Services in 2023. This is a momentous thing for our community. Her goal as the director is to create a brave space for undocumented students and undocumented educators to feel welcomed, inspired, and celebrated. Maria received an AAT in Communication Studies from Chaffey College, a BA in Communication Studies from California State University, San Bernardino, and a master's degree in higher education, student affairs from the University of Redlands. Maria enjoys local coffee shops, visiting local gardens, and supporting undocumented LGBTQ+ and BIPOC creators and entrepreneurs. Maria Barragan. And finally, sorry, I have to switch to a virtual mode here. Alejandra Alarcón, ella, joined the Center for the Study of Los Angeles at LMU in 2015. Her research areas of interest are local campaigns and voter access, education, and outreach. She is passionate about language access and works with academic centers, nonprofit organizations, and local progressive campaigns on creating culturally sound Spanish-first content. She enjoys roller skating, romance novels, 2000s television series, and podcast series. She earned her BA in Chicano and Latina Studies at LMU, where she was active in MECHA and Marion's service organization. Welcome, Ali. So before I guide us into a first question, being that it is an event of the LMU Latinx Theology and Ministry Initiative, and that we have esteemed theologians with us here and people of faith, and we are a community that serves to promote faith and justice. I can't help but try an invocation from Scripture. And I think many of you are familiar with this, but every time I hear this particular scripture, it resonates deeply with me and my community. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus. In Hebrews, let mutual love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. And of course, from Matthew, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. So, colleagues and students, esteemed faculty and staff of our community, we are just now a few weeks from election night, and I can't help but think back to another election night in 2016, and a moment that rocked our community here. But I'd like to begin by asking each of you to open up our theme tonight, immigration, disinformation, and how we can rebut the stories that are being told about our communities with our own stories. So I'd like to ask each of you just to briefly narrate something from your lives, an encounter in your own family life, or an encounter with strangers, perhaps here in our own LMU community, something that touches you deeply and that it's a story to tell to counter the other stories being told about our community. Can we start with you, Brett Hoover? Sure.
I think this microphone died.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
sure, yeah. So I was thinking about this question, and it brought me back to when I was doing some research in a small town in the Midwest. And this was a town that had been transformed by immigration from Mexico, a town that's probably equivalent in many ways to Springfield, Ohio, in terms of the Haitian community. And while I was there listening to people, I was studying a Catholic parish that was split between Anglo and Mexican parishioners. While I was listening to people, I met this great couple. I'm going to call them Gabby and Javier for reasons that you'll see. I'm not going to tell you their actual names. But they were a great couple because Gabby was she was very like opinionated and sometimes a little sarcastic. One time she was driving me home in her minivan with her kids strapped into the car seats in the back, and we pull out of the church parking lot and she points towards the kind of older, poorer parts of the town and the like newer, more shiny part of the town, and she goes, "Anglos or Hispanics?" And I actually lived in the Hispanic part, but anyway, even though I'm a white dude. And she when I came back to visit, she would give me a hard time because she thought I wasn't keeping up with my Spanish well enough. But she had a husband, Javier, who was very like sober and serious, like kind of different from her. It sometimes happens in the annals of couples, yeah. And he was one time I went to dinner at their house. And he comes out when I'm parking my car, and he says, "Professor Brett, you need to back up a little bit and make sure you're here." He had like very, very strict rules for parking. And part of the story here is that Gabby and Javier were undocumented. And as many of you all know, when you're undocumented, you make extra sure that you obey the rules, you obey the laws, that you don't tangle yourself. And he, but by God, he was not going to let this white dude mess up his relationship with his neighbors. And so this was my experience of them, and they were lovely people. I so much enjoyed being with them. And then sometimes most of the Anglo parishioners in the town that I worked with through the church were actually, most of them were welcome. They were happy because in ways, again, like Springfield, Ohio, the coming of Mexican immigrants had rejuvenated the economy of the town. The Catholic school was saved. But there were some people that were listening to, radio or politicians and saying things, well, they're the illegals, they're criminals. They're scofflaws. They just come here to take advantage of the services. And I'd hear this, and then I'd be thinking of Gabby and Javier. And I'd be like, they work in a factory all day, and then she's the youth minister at the parish, and he is the director of religious education. They do this for the Hispanic community. They are volunteers. The two people who are doing this in the Anglo community are getting a salary. And I said, and they're the scofflaws and criminals? Like it was an experience of like kind of psychological whiplash to listen to this. And also I was like, dude, I ride in their minivan. Like who could be more like a soccer mom than Gabby, So that's my story.
Yes, thank you. And in the sheet that's been passed around, one of the first bits of information to fight back against the disinformation about the criminality stereotype is just statistic after statistic, study after study shows that the community is much less prone to crime, serious crime, and precisely as your anecdote illustrates, for obvious reasons, because of a vulnerability and the reasons why they're here in the first place. So thank you, Brett. Thank you. Maria, would you like to, and before, oh, you need the microphone?
Oh, no, she has the microphone.
Go, Ali first?
Yeah.
Okay, very well. Okay, we'll go.
We're going to keep giving instructions.
Got it. That's right. Yeah.
That's
yeah,
fine.
okay, great. So like many of you, for local elections, I follow various races who's running against who. But sometimes it's secondary to what I really focus on, and that is our election system. How many voters are registered? How many vote centers do we have? Where are they? Real nerdy stuff. And I've been following this since 2016 because that is when California passed the Voting Rights Act, which has made California have one of the most inclusive voting systems in the nation. You can think of Election Day as not one election, but 51 elections running simultaneously, because every state has a different set of laws, right? Here in California, let me just share some of the amazing reforms that we have made. I know Maria has more information to share about this later, but in California, you automatically, if you're registered to vote, you automatically receive an absentee ballot. That ballot is already postmarked. That ballot you can return at any vote center, or you can return it at a post office. And actually, if you're registered, you'll receive it on October 7th. So soon, right? You can register to vote same day if you'd like. You can vote at any vote center. Vote centers are located in places where the community is already at. Here at LMU, we'll have a vote center. Most schools, most churches, but we even have mobile vote centers that move around in front of theme parks, at sporting events. Dodger Stadium always has a vote center, SoFi Stadium, even Universal City Walk. You have some that move throughout the day, right? Because in California, we do whatever we can to make sure that to make it as easy as possible to vote. There are still some barriers, but we've tried our best to eliminate some of them. Even having 16-year-olds pre-register so that the moment that they turn 18, even if that they're able to vote. That means that if they're going to be 18, turning 18 between a primary and general election, they're allowed to vote at 17 and a half in the primary, so that way they also have a say in the general. Now, why am I telling you about about the Voting Rights Act? The Voting Rights Act, its implementation was seen by Alex Padilla, the U.S. Senator of California. Alex Padilla he's a mechanical engineer. That's his background. He has a mechanical engineering degree from MIT. What launched his career into politics was the passing of Proposition 187 in 1994, which basically barred undocumented people from accessing non-emergency public services. It actually did pass, but it was struck down by the courts, and it launched a mobilization efforts. There were a lot of protests, and there were a lot of young people that decided, this is my moment, I'm going to organize. And that looked very different for different people. For Alex Padilla, it meant that he was going to start working on campaigns. He had jobs working for city council officers, for legislators, then eventually becoming a city council member himself, then president of the Los Angeles City Council, which is arguably one of the most powerful positions in Los Angeles County and in California. He found his way to the state Senate, and then he became the Secretary of State, where he was in charge of overseeing many of the reforms that I talked about earlier. In 2020, Joe Biden wins. Kamala Harris is set to become the Vice President of the United States, leaving her position as US Senate. So then Governor Gavin Newsom has an important decision to make, to appoint someone to step into that role. There was a lot of talk, there was a lot of pressure on who he would select. And he ended up selecting now US Senator Alex Padilla. And if you haven't watched it, the video call of Governor Gavin Newsom reaching out to Alex Padilla is one that makes me cry every single time, because he seemingly has no idea that he's about to be asked to step into this role. Governor Newsom asks him, like, tell me about your family. Tell me about your mom, tell me about your dad. And he says so. Eventually, Governor Newsom asks him, are you willing to serve the state of California in the capacity of a US Senator? He doesn't say yes exactly. He says that he is honored and that he is humbled because of his parents, and proceeds to talk about his parents. His parents are both from Mexico and from different states. They met in Los Angeles, where they were married and started a family. His dad was a line cook for many, many years through retirement. His mom cleaned homes. And that's what they did to put their family forward, right? And so he talks about how everything that he's done in his career has been in their name, for them and for families like them. and why he's so concerned with things like having an inclusive democracy. Well, it's for people like them, why he's so concerned to make sure that our democracy is as inclusive as we've built it. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that video of his appointment, I highly encourage it. It is a tearjerker. But when I think a lot about elections and voting and access and equity and representation in democracy, I think of how Alex Padilla has championed California and how being the son of immigrants himself has been a core part of why he does what he does.
Thank you so much. There's and there are so many stories just like that, millions of stories across California and across the country now of parents, grandparents, and their journeys. And tonight is really about rediscovering those stories, because it feels like there's an avalanche that's covered up those stories, buried our stories, our community stories. One of the great stories about Maria Barragan is that her presence here among us is the result of what began in 2016 as a shock to our community, as a trauma to our community. Very briefly, I remember very clearly the night after the election, there was a meeting of DoCU students and their allies in one of the rooms here, actually, in University Hall. There's a bunch of kids sitting on the floor in tears, in tears. The university, we'll get into this a little bit later. The university didn't have much of a plan for that, because a lot of people just didn't think that it could happen, but it happened. Those kids were in tears. Many of those students have gone on. I can think of a couple of concrete examples, like kind of like Alex, you know, that difficult moment forged tremendous leadership and organization among the community, but it was hard. That's the reason why Maria Barragan is here as the first director of the Undocumented Student Services Center. So welcome, Maria. I don't think you've had that many opportunities to speak to the community at large, but welcome, and let's hear your voice.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for going first. That really does help calm my nerves a little. I get anxious sometimes and I cry. I'm a chillona, hard, proud of it. I want to apologize, but I'll give you a warning. I also use sarcasm sometimes to tell my story or to tell stories. That's a way of like processing my trauma. Again, I want to apologize, but giving you a heads up in case it naturally comes out. It's normal. But you know, there's many stories I can tell you because I have been working with undocumented students since 2010 when my brother was deported. Right? I can take you back to 2001 when I came to this country, but I won't do that. I'll share with you my own personal connection to immigration. When I went to a counselor's office, I knew I was undocumented since the moment I arrived to this country. That's something my parents never did for me, which is very different to a typical undocumented student, right? That they don't find out until they're in the process of applying for college. I knew all along. Back then, we didn't have a term for like undocumented. We would use all the negative terms that are used to dehumanize us, right? We would use them to describe our own experience. So I go to the counselor's office and I'm like, hey, like I've been thinking about college, but I don't think that it's doable. And she looks at me and she says like, oh, you're just gonna be another statistic in the immigrant community. You're gonna end up pregnant, you're gonna drop out, why bother? I was navid, I was like taking all these like college prep courses. And so I was like, she's right, why bother? I'm an angry person, have been an angry person since maybe I was born. I don't know, but my mom says, you know, I've always been an angry person. So I held that anger and I let it out on a lot of people, right? I would get in fights. I would like, my mom already knew if the high school was calling, it was because I was gonna be sent home. And her response was like, have her walk, I lived across the high school. So she's like, have her walk around the long way so she can cool off. And it wasn't until one of my professors or one of my teachers actually sat with me and she said, you need to get your ish together. Like, stop behaving the way you're behaving. you're capable of doing whatever you want to do regardless of your status. And I said, I don't think so, because my sister had to self-deport in order to follow her educational dreams. So I might have to do the same. And she's like, no, we're gonna find you resources. We're gonna find you something. And it wasn't until I was getting ready to graduate, I was like, not even applying to colleges. I didn't care. I was like, whatever. I'm gonna be that statistic, right? And then I meet someone, and then he's like, remember that 5th grade field trip you went to visit this like local community college? And I was like, oh yeah, but we don't talk about that because my dad didn't. Because back then we couldn't go out because you never know if you catch la migra or like they catch you, I should say. And my dad wouldn't let us out, but my mom let me go on this trip. So he tells me, okay, well, this trip was actually a 2-year scholarship. And he's like, if you go to our community college. So that's kind of how my educational journey started. I finally felt a sense of hope. And he said, if you study hard, you might get your papers. Because during that time, we were advocating for the DREAM Act. I became very involved in immigrants' rights movement, civil disobediences, protests, walkouts, sit-ins, you name it. I participated in them because I was also affected by deportation. My brother was deported on my 18th birthday. So there's a lot. Again, I can take you all the way back, right? But now I'm able to be that hope for students. I'm able to light their candle regardless of their immigration status and say, you can do it too, right? I can't tell them like that they'll get papers if they go to school, like they told me, because that wasn't my pathway. I'm a survivor of domestic violence. That was my pathway to citizenship. And it sucks so much that we have to be like physically, mentally, financially abused in order to qualify for our social security number, for that passport that we all dream of, right? And I can't tell my students that their education is what's gonna get them that social security number, that status that they dream of. But I can show them the ways in which they can thrive regardless of their immigration status. And it's just so wonderful to see that I didn't have that someone to believe in me, but now I can be that someone for everyone I have had the opportunity to work with.
Thank you for your presence, your witness, your commitment, and being part of our community now, Maria. Let me throw out a couple of questions, and remember, you guys are going to be participating with questions back in just a little bit. Let's talk about how the stories, because our theme here is stories about our community, and then the stories that we know, that we live, and that we can tell about our own community. The stories against the other stories, right? Because the false stories that get told again and again and again and again, and if nothing else, the sheer energy of the anti-immigrant campaign in repeating the falsehoods, these stories, some of these stories are as Associate Dean Elisa Rodriguez mentioned earlier, are the butt of memes and funny jokes, and but there's nothing funny for the Haitian community in Springfield, or the Venezuelan community in Aurora, or the Haitians and Venezuelans and undocumented people all over the country right now. But those falsehoods become true. They become a truth, and obscuring our truth. So let's talk about the impact of those stories. Just anybody who wants to chime in here. What are the stories that you think are really having the greatest negative impact that you hear out there, that you feel are hitting the community in a particularly powerful negative way? And we can talk about maybe how to push back against them. What are the toughest stories we hear out there? Want to start, Maria?
There's so many. that it's hard to like focus on just one, right? But I think thinking back to like my educator had, and I think there's a lot of disinformation on undocumented students not being able to pursue higher education if they don't have a DACA status. So there's a lot of counselors or a lot of other educators telling students like, oh, you don't have DACA, so therefore you're not able to study or go beyond your high school diploma, right? I think that is very hurtful to our community because again, they lose that hope. There's also like misinformation, again, going back to like my personal story of there's no resources for survivors of domestic violence if they are undocumented. Like again, there's such a long list of disinformation that is out there. One big one that we also see is that connection that undocumented people are all from Mexico. That erases the stories of Black undocumented immigrants, of API undocumented immigrants, right? So we silence those voices and we tend to center the Latinx voice of undocumented immigrants. And even on our campus, we see the existence of undocumented Black students and undocumented API students.
I would like to go back to what Professor Martinez, you said about the crime story. That as Ruben said, immigrants in general, and particularly undocumented immigrants, are much less likely to engage in crime than U.S. citizens. And this has been documented, as you said, over and over again. In 40 cities over 40 years, they found that the more immigration that a neighborhood had, the less crime it had. And in Texas arrest records in 2020, it was found that that undocumented people were arrested at much lower levels than either immigrants with papers or U.S. citizens, and yet it persists, right? And I mean, it came up just last night at the vice presidential debate. Yes, the Republican candidate for vice president, J.D. Vance, he actually doubled the number of people of immigrants who are in the system who have a criminal record, just I guess because he decided to. And he also doubled the number of undocumented immigrants in the country, which is an impressive feat to do just by and he mentioned he associated fentanyl smuggling, another crime, with immigrants, even though most of the records of people being intercepted smuggling fentanyl, I think it's about 89%, are U.S. citizens, which makes sense. They're the least likely people get caught, right? And so that is, and it's damaging because, I think of this as a Catholic theologian. It's damaging by design because it does not want people to see that underneath all these categories and stereotypes and bad information are people. And when we talk about Catholic social teaching, we talk about people being made in the image and likeness of God. And it doesn't, I mean, the book of Genesis on purpose stands out in its own ancient world for saying that it's all people who are made in the image and likeness of God, and not just the kings or the warriors or the priests. We say that because of that, people have dignity. And so to assign them to a category or to say that they're just reduced to something is a very damaging thing. And it is being done. I mean, the difference between, as we know, between misinformation and disinformation is it isn't an accident when people make these statements. They're doing it on purpose. It's an old tactic, right? They did it to my Irish ancestors, and they, who were a bunch of drunken brawlers, apparently. They did it to the Italians. They were all part of the mafia, right? Even though even the historical statistics don't back this up, it's been a big part of anti-Black racism in this country, associations with crime. But as I said, because of what you said, Ruben, about the repetition, let me repeat that immigrants are less likely to be engaged in crime than U.S. citizens.
Debates are really interesting to watch because of just everything that can be said, right? One of the things I'm mindful of is that every single talking point is for someone. They're trying to capture a wide audience. Not every talking point will speak to you. So thinking about the presidential debate, when the comment about pets being eaten in Springfield, we know just hearing it offhand that it's a very absurd thing to suggest, right? But maybe perhaps we did not understand immediately why he chose to say that. Because maybe that wasn't for us. Maybe that was specifically for the people in the Midwest who encounter Haitian migrants in their community. Maybe he was perpetuating the stereotype, right? But when I think back to that debate, and I think about other talking points that I've made from that campaign, the one that scares me the most, that worries me the most, is this talking point about how migrants are poisoning our blood. And it scares me because I have to ask myself, who is that talking point for? And where are these people that this talking point is speaking to? Are they in my community? Maybe if not in Los Angeles or in California, they're somewhere in the US. And then I think about images of coming out of the Republican National Convention of a sea of people holding up signs that say mass deportation now, right? So I do not have the answer to how do we combat that narrative. I know that inherently that narrative is false. It dehumanizes people. Why are we so worried about poisoning our blood? Can we think of when else that talking point has been used and what the consequences were then? So it's not exactly, I chose to answer the question I wanted to answer, and that's like, what is the talking point that scares you most? And that is the one for me.
Yes, and Trump just echoed that yesterday, today, the days are blending together now, but in a small town in Wisconsin, he was saying that the country was being turned into third world, that expletive hole, right? And it's coming hard and fast every single day, and it's not just obviously today. It's the accumulation of this repetition ever since the first campaign event in 2015, right? It's been constant. How we all work on this campus, we're part of this community. How do you guys feel our students? I have contact with students, of course, myself. How are our Latinx students documented, undocumented, or second or third generation? Because there's also an impact beyond. It's a community-wide thing, and this is a Latinx event. How is our community feeling here on this campus right now?
I think the students that I have the opportunity to work with, it's an opportunity for us to reflect on what is being said, and for us to really find ways to make sure that we share the correct information with our community, right? We see it as a way to empower ourselves rather than sit back and feel bad for ourselves. So for us, is how do we go out into the community and educate them about the correct information, right? One of the things that students have shared is sometimes the things others within our community say are more harmful and more hurtful than what 45 is saying, right? Because there are students, their peers, their family members, their like community members, church members that are hearing the things 45 is saying, and they're repeating it and they're believing it. And so for the students, that is more harmful and more hurtful than again hearing it from 45, because to them it's just like, oh, here he goes again, right? Like that he thinks he's so funny. And like I said, a lot of times we as immigrants use sarcasm as a way to combat our traumas or like overcome them. And so, yeah, like there are times where we laugh about it and we're like, okay, now let's move on, reflect. How do we make sure that we educate the community on our real experience?
I think to Maria's point, something different about students now and then is that the students that we have at LMU currently have lived through a Trump presidency. So thinking back, you alluded to this earlier, but in 2016, part of the reason why many of us, faculty and staff included, were caught off guard is because we never imagined that we would live through a Trump presidency. The things he said, the racist, xenophobic, misogynistic, transphobic, ableist things he said are not the and the list goes on, are not the qualities of somebody at the top position of our country, right? We never imagined, so much so that he did not win the popular vote, Hillary Clinton did, but the Electoral College, which by the way does have a racist function, worked exactly the way it was supposed to, right? Which led us to that moment. Students, the other interesting thing about working on a college campus is that more often than not, our students are first-time voters, right? So maybe the first time that they are really taking in the campaigns and elections landscape. But the difference between our students, I think sentiment-wise, it feels more or less the same with the difference, and maybe it's a big difference, that students today have lived through a Trump presidency. So it's not hypothetical. It's when he says that his plan is to deport, detain, arrest, we believe that. We believe that as a possibility, right? And so I think to Maria's point is, as faculty and staff and student leaders, being aware of what are we communicating to our students? How are we preparing our students to meet the moment? And what happens what do we do if this election result goes differently from how we want it to?
And I think this might be a perfect time to share with the community. Some of you might be familiar with this. We get a lot of stuff in our inboxes. So it's split by me actually, but Maria Barragan, you were part of a task force that put together a lot of resources for our community. And Morgan, if we want, I think we can put up on the screens there that page. Do you want to mention what we've got, the resources we have, Maria?
Yeah, so there, LMU put together a work group to put different resources to really educate people on like this election. So we'll go to this website, it's lmu.edu/vote. It has a countdown, so if we scroll down, you'll see a countdown of when election is coming up, but if you continue to scroll down, you'll find different toolkits, toolkits for students, toolkits for faculty, staff. You'll find different information. There's also, if you continue to scroll down, there's an interactive map that is like very informative. I highly encourage all of you to really look through this resource and utilize it. I know that I do want to be mindful that there might be people that, in this space that cannot vote. You can still engage, right? You can still learn about the different policies. Know that you still have a right to contact your Congress representative and ask them to, defend certain policies, to advocate for certain things. You still have that right if you live in their region or whatever it's called, region, right? No, they call it something else. I used to volunteer for a congresswoman and I don't even remember. But district, thank you. God, don't tell her. She would be very disappointed right now. But I really do encourage everyone, like those of you that can vote, vote. And if you're like unsure of like whether you should vote or not, yesterday I had the opportunity to hear Stacey Abrams speak, and she said it so beautifully. It won't come out the same. But if you at least vote for someone that can't, right? Those that are documented, those that are wrongfully convicted, those that are like international students, like please vote for us, right? If you can. Well, I shouldn't say us because this is gonna be my first time voting. Super excited. I do encourage all of you to, take action one way or another.
Sorry, Brett.
No, no, no.
Oh, I wanted to underscore two of the things that Maria just spoke about. The one is, it's this concept called voter tripling, that if I, as one individual, speak to just 3 other people and encourage them to learn the issues, open their ballot, do the research, fill out and vote, then my impact times 3. And if those 3 people talk to 3 other people, that's 9 additional people, right? You would be, I promise you that there's at least one person in your life, a family member, a friend, a colleague, who is so confused and or overwhelmed by their ballot that they're probably thinking about not submitting it. I believe Stacey, she said so many great things.
Yes.
One of the things she said is that a lot of the times, registered voters, they know what side they're on, they know who they're voting for or how they're voting for. What changes, or what may change between now and election day, is what they decide to do about it. And that first decision is, am I even going to go to the polling place? Am I actually going to submit a ballot? But I also, in the spirit of taking action, wanted to echo something else that Stacey Abrams said that I think speaks to a lot of the themes that we've touched on here tonight. She talked about the relationship between advocacy and empathy. Advocacy is the action that we take. It's what we do with empathy. Empathy is saying, I know what that feels like because I have felt that way before. Advocacy is what we do with those feelings. So I want everyone to just sit with that, because as a big cheerleader as I am for please go vote, it's one, recognizing that not everyone can, but also voting is the first step. It's not voting is not going to save us. There are other efforts and actions that we can take that I don't know to say will save us, but I do believe the community will save us.
How many people were at Stacey Abrams last night? I hope there was more hands, but there was a lot of people there, right?
Yes.
Yes. And how many students present are voting in their first presidential election? That's quite a few hands. Yeah, that's exciting. That's wonderful. Did you have something on this point? Please.
Yeah, no, well, maybe even going backwards a little bit, but to your question, Ruben, but I was thinking that, last week, how many folks are here from mine and Rebecca Sager's class? Cool. Thank you. I mean, I know I required you to come, so thank you. But what last week we had, or was it last week? Yes, we had Zach Hoover who's the president of LA Voice, come talk to the class about community orientation. And one of the things he reminded me of, which and this is out there for you theology nerds. Yeah, I'm talking to you too. That he reminded me about Ignatius's presupposition at the beginning of the spiritual exercises. So Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, and what he starts with is that, basically paraphrasing a bit, that you should take people as being well-intentioned, and when you meet them and start to engage with them. And I bring this up because disinformation crushes that, because you don't know who to trust, and you begin to be suspicious of everyone, and particularly maybe people who are different from you. So when you were talking about damage in particular to the Latinx community, and that is an important place to start, but it's doing damage to all of us because of the way that it affects our ability to trust one another.
The social fabric. Yes, good. Thank you, Brett. And speaking of shout outs to classrooms, Borderlands class students, raise your hand. They were also required to come, but thank you. Thank you. So this is a theology event, and of course we've been making theology here. Everything we've said is actually theology and the promotion of faith and justice. So in the largest possible sense, but we'd be remiss without perhaps digging a little deeper. Can I plug your book again?
I did not pay him to do this.
In going through Immigration and Faith by Dr. Hoover, found a lot of citations of a lot of great theologians, and there's a chapter about migration and theology, and a wonderful concept that I'd love for you to talk about a little bit. Theologian at Georgetown, you said, the idea of a migrant God, and which seems to just fit perfectly here. If you'd like to pick up on that thread.
Peter Fan is the theologian that some of you know. But he wrote an article and then wrote about it a few times. But the idea is that in Christian thinking, God creates the world. And if you remember, for those of you who remember the book of Genesis in the Jewish and Christian traditions, it talks about God blowing the breath of life into the human being. So this idea of God creating the world in Judaism and Christianity and Islam as well is not an idea like, well, he set it in motion and then left it behind. There's this idea that we have in Christianity of a sustaining creation, that the creation continues because God continues to love creation. So it's this idea of God going out into the world. And of course, in Christianity, this is augmented by the idea of Jesus being the Son of God sent into the world, and that the Holy Spirit is sent into the world to use the word you used, Alejandra, save us. But so that's the idea of the migrant God, that God in God's self is on the move in a way.
Yes, and I like so many people here. Well, we all have stories of migration. It's just a matter of from where and when, right? But I followed migrant stories because of the stories in my own family, and as I followed other migrants, it was a way of following my own family's footsteps, and just the idea, the biblical like symbolism, the obvious biblical symbolism of it, that also just gets lost because they crossed the river, they got their backs wet, and then the stereotypes that come out of that. But the river, crossing Jordan to get to the other side, right? A travail through the desert. These journeys are imbued with deep spiritual significance, and both Old and New Testament. If I learned anything from my foundations of Old Testament theology, that God is looking out for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. As I said, we were all making theology here, but if either of you had anything to say on this point, and perhaps also just to make it like an LMU kind of question, how do you see our mission being fulfilled right now at this particular moment as we face this political juncture?
Oh man, I think it's the Jesuit Volunteer Corps that have that slogan that you're ruined for life. I have been at LMU as a staff member since 2015, but there's only like a couple of months between when I stopped my undergraduate studies and that. So I've been on this campus for nearly half my life. So I can't. I don't know how to live without instilling Jesuit values, right? Which is something as a social science survey researcher and also as an organizer, it's like, okay, like, where do I see God in social science research? And in my particular role in research communications, it is centering the stories of the marginalized. But to your question about like in this particular moment, we are all called to serve in different ways. For myself, our team, we're working on a lot of local governance reform. So if here on the ballot, you'll see Measure G about expanding the Board of Supervisors, similar ballot measures for the city of Los Angeles, moving elections from odd to even years is something that the Center for the City of Los Angeles had its little hand in. And when you get to your polling place, you will absolutely see the voter bill of rights because every polling place is required to have it posted somewhere where it's very easy to see. And the Center for the City of Los Angeles had a very big role in that. So for myself, it's through my research, and I suspect that for many faculty, it is that way. For some of our students, it's organizing, whether it's preparing for what will that moment look like when what the election results are. And if it's supporting Maria and creating the resources that our entire campus community will benefit from, if it's creating promotional items so that people know how it is that they can cast their vote, right? We see it in many different ways, in the ways that our students and our faculty and staff choose to meet the moment.
Maria, do you want to chime in?
I'm very new to the Jesuit world. I've only been here a year. I did grow up Catholic, but have explored many other religions because try to find myself. And here I am, right? Still not knowing like where I stand. And I say that because sometimes I question everything that I have or my students have lived through, and I question, did God really want us to go through that? Right? Like you hear a lot like God gives like certain fights to like his strongest soldiers. And I'm like, dang, like, but I'm a tired one. Like, chill, right? And so when I hear like students come into my office and telling me all the terrible things that they're going through, I question that. But taking it back to LMU, right? I chose LMU because they were not afraid to use social justice within their mission. That was like, to me, such a big thing. And as I was meeting, within the committees that were interviewing me, the different groups, I saw that they really meant it, that they really cared about like showing up for students in the, like, as their best advocates, right? Like one of the questions from a faculty member was like, are you willing to get arrested for our students? I'm like, we can do that? Finally, when is the protest, right? And so the fact that I'm here, I think speaks volumes. The fact that one of my supervisors happens to be a Jesuit, and he's like my biggest mentor, shout out to Jose Vadenes. He's one of my biggest mentors, my biggest supporters. I go to him and I'm like, oh my God, we need this. And he's like, don't worry, I got you. Oh my God, that is so refreshing. So for me, is continue to learn what it truly means to live by those Jesuit values, right? Challenge myself to like stop myself when I'm having those questions of like, God, are you really real? Like, look at this student, right? To really challenge myself to reflect back and say like, no, like, let me take this back and let me ask for assistance from everyone in the LMU community because everyone's so willing to help. So I am learning and growing and ready to challenge myself to live by those Jesuit values. So I hope that answers the question.
Beautifully, thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'm the Catholic theologian on the panel, so, I don't need to talk about this, but I think, what I wanted to say is that, I mean, okay, so I'm a professional Catholic. So a lot of my work is going to be kind of churchy, I connect with a lot of people in the community, and we talk about what to do about these kinds of things. But here at LMU, I think one of the wonderful things that and what you're saying, Maria, is really taps into that, is the number of people that are ready to step up, to serve faith, to promote justice, and how important that is. And I was thinking about, so in our class, of course, preparing for this, I asked the students to read something about kind of how disinformation works, which is from the International Organization on Migration. And one of the things that I found that was interesting in there is that apparently there's these Dutch scholars who are developing online gaming platforms and programs that are supposed to that research has shown when people play them, it actually helps them be more resistant to disinformation. And I thought, we got a lot of folks working on gaming at LMU, and I bet if some of those folks, and maybe they already are, they heard about how this is possible, they'd be on that in 5 seconds, right? So we all have a role to play in terms of the mission in the way that you're saying, Maria. And yes, we are ready to step up with you.
Thank you. I think this is a good moment to transition perhaps to questions from the audience. And let's see. We have. hmm,
Oh, they have,
Oh, they have cards. Oh, they haven't filled them out yet.
they can fill them out.
Ah, so you- Yes.
Let me jump in.
And
Sure.
as people collectible, sorry, if I can add one thing, because you reminded
And
me
you got
of
the cards,
something.
please fill them out. Ask a quick question. Yes.
But we talk a lot about disinformation, and we have to also ask ourselves, how do we engage in that, right? Because a lot of times we think, like, we see these funny videos of talking about immigrants, right? Like all those videos all those TikToks that came out when the comment about like eating the cats and the pets and the dogs, and people right away started creating TikToks with their own pets, like just looking at them like, right? And we share that thinking like, oh my God, this is hilarious, but that's causing damage. So another way that we can stop that disinformation is by not sharing those type of videos. Because let's look at the amount of shares that those videos have and the harm that it's causing. Yes, it might be funny, but it's adding on to that, right? To that comment that 45 made. I don't like saying his name, so we'll stick with 45. But it's so harmful. Like the more shares that they get, the more harm we cause to our community. So if you see it, don't share it.
And to Maria's point, it's getting increasingly harder, right, in the age of artificial intelligence, because you watch a video and you're like, is this even real? But taking it like a step further than that is when you read tweets or news articles or whatever that's providing false information, the best way to address it is to not. And so one of the things that I really appreciate about this one pager is that each statement starts with, contrary to disinformation, it doesn't tell you what the false statements that have been perpetuated have been. It's just letting you know that there have been false statements made, right? And then it gives you facts. And so we don't walk away, we can look at this and we'll remember like one or two bullet points really well. We don't remember the things that were false or that are lies because they're not on here for us to remember. But we do, if we recall anything on here, we remember what is true. And so I think that's something to be really mindful of as we engage, especially with social media, about our conversations with other people as well, to not in any way address or recognize the falsehoods that are out there.
Very good.
Our own.
Please fill out your cards, by the way, if you have questions, they're going around collecting those. But yeah, I just wanted to add to what you were saying, Alejandra, that a lot of the research on disinformation, one of the things it shows is that it is remarkably effective just to ask people to stop and think when they're reading something. Like, does this really make sense? Is this really, where is this coming from? What Russian company is funding it, or whatever. I'm being just a little bit sarcastic, but yeah, it's remarkably effective.
Sorry. Thank you. Okay, some questions are trickling in. Here's the first one. Can you speak more about the process of undocumented people attending university and getting papers through that?
That doesn't, how do I say this? That doesn't really happen, right? That is not an option of like going to school and you get your papers, or you get a pathway to citizenship. What happened is that back in 2001, then 2010, then I wanna say, 2010, people were advocating for what we call the DREAM Act. And the DREAM Act was going to be a pathway to citizenship for undocumented students. And I say students because a lot of the requirements were like graduated from high school, has a 3-point-something GPA, will attend college, and if you won't attend college, then you'll enroll in the services like the Army, the Navy. So that was a lot of our thought process or hope that like, oh my God, this hasn't passed yet, but it might someday, right? And from there, a lot of policies were adopted from like being inspired from the DREAM Act, which has been like 85-40 in the state of California. This is all like most of it California based. It all depends on the state that you're in, but like being able to pay in-state tuition, right? but that has a lot of requirements. Getting a California Dream Act, which is like a financial aid application, but for undocumented students. But even for that, there's a whole list of requirements. There's different policies that allow undocumented students to attend higher education in the state of California, but with that comes a lot of requirements. So it's a short way of answering it, but it's a lot of information.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you, Maria. Here's another couple of questions. One is, it is very direct to the point of the panel today. How can we reach people who believe disinformation?
Good question.
And I'm just going to ask the audience quickly, how many people in their extended family have people that might fit this profile? That's like half, maybe 40% of people raise their hands just now. So I think we all have my deal, you know, yeah. So how do we reach people who have consumed this disinformation and take it as truth? Very direct question.
I'm happy to. You look like that's upset.
I actually asked the same question for an episode of NPR's Latino USA. They had someone, they had a columnist answering questions, and this was my question to him. Because at the time, the episode came out in late 2020, there was a lot of false information around the COVID-19, the coronavirus, as well as the vaccine, right? And so I'm going to offer to you what he offered to me, and that is to make sure that we continue it when we have these conversations, to continue meeting our friends, colleagues, family members with facts. Our family group chat, like maybe like 5 out of 10 times is my mom being like sending something like, is this real? And my sister will be like, no, and yeah, like you better like, no mom, actually, and then like that the actual like fact. And I've noticed that those kinds of interactions make a difference, right? And so I see someone being like, no, I'm like, it's not gonna solve everything. But it does help to be persistent and to meet those conversations with fact.
I would just echo that, but I will say this, is that, I mean, obviously, there are moments, and this has happened with me in my own family, where you know, where a piece of disinformation, and because I study migration, that's usually where I'm like batting about with my aunt, God rest her soul, who is believing all kinds of things. But so we can't, they're not always going to listen. It isn't always going to work. I think we should start with that caution. But I do think that that not only facts, but also knowing what you're talking about. You know, doing research. As my brother-in-law always says, you know, reading about something on the internet is not research. That's right. Like we're about research here. That ain't enough. So part of it is becoming well informed on the issues that you're concerned about. So much so that you've got, you know, if you have our little one sheeter or whatever, you have facts at your disposal in order to counter some of these things. I mean, I think that does have an effect. My aunt did sometimes listen to me, and then sometimes she didn't.
There's a great question here, kind of like a thread the needle political question. How can we resist aspects of VP Harris's platform, parentheses, pro-ICE, pro-deportation, without empowering former President Trump?
I would like to speak to that.
Yes.
To me, this is the heart of the matter, in a way. I mean, Donald Trump is a kind of phenomenon, right? Like, one of the things I always say to people is that you know, there is the left and the right, the Democrats and the Republicans. There's you know, and then there's this thing, this orange thing. You know, Donald Trump, who comes into the political arena with a very different style, you know, with populist beliefs and communications, and with a kind of heart for disinformation. So to me, it isn't about actually conservatives and liberals or Republicans and Democrats. It's about this particular candidate and his vice presidential candidate and their penchant for lying. Let's be honest, lying. So I think in terms of threading the needle, it's important to separate out the disinformation about the issues from the candidates and say, look, it doesn't matter who's saying this, it's not true. And it seems to me that it's very important for us as people of goodwill, people of faith, people who are intelligent to be able to do that.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. How can we resist aspects of VP Harris's platform, pro-ICE, pro-deportation platform, without empowering former President Trump?
I'm still processing.
It's not easy.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. My parents are from Central America. They're from Nicaragua. You alluded to this earlier, but Donald Trump said that my parents are from an Ishbal country. So that's a reality. But Vice President Kamala Harris went to Guatemala and told migrants, don't come here. And that was really upsetting to me because one of the things that we don't talk about enough, let's talk about why we have an immigration issue, right? Or why, instead of, I'll just end that right there, right? And so in terms of thinking about my parents being Central American, that's something that I contend with. Both have said things that have been insulting or disrespectful to my heritage. But I believe in democracy. I believe in having an election in 2028. I believe in maybe not arresting people because they are currently in office. And Donald Trump has promised to arrest people. Donald Trump has also promised that this will be the last time we vote. Those things are scary. And so what I offer to the person who asked this question is thinking about local elections. I don't know if you're following local races, but Black Lives Matter Los Angeles often gets involved in local races, and I really like their approach. For example, they were involved with the district attorney race 4 years ago. It was Jackie Lacey, the incumbent, versus George Gascon, who's our current DA. They did not endorse George Gascon, but they hit the pavement, knocked on doors, and protested Jackie Lacey every single week for over a year. That it's hard to deny that they had a role in making sure that she wasn't elected, right? And so their platform wasn't an endorsement of George Gascon, it was a rebuking of Jackie Lacey. And you see them, they're very active in the Council District 14 race in Northeast Los Angeles currently. It's Isabel Jurado versus Kevin De Leon. If that name isn't familiar to you, Kevin De Leon was one of the people involved in the audio leak where city council members were saying very disrespectful, derogatory comments about various marginalized communities who's running for office. And so Black Lives Matter isn't saying we are for Isabel Jurado, they are saying we are against Kevin De Leon. And I really appreciate that approach. And in many ways, that is the approach that I'm taking, that I was taking before Vice President Harris jumped into the race. And in many ways, I'm still taking now.
Yeah, do you want to? Oh, wait.
Not just yet. There's a question online, but please proceed.
Okay, please.
Just really quickly, I said I'm still processing that question because we tend to put these politicians in such a pedestal, right? We idolize them and we're like, oh my God, they're gonna do such great things. She has such a bad reputation working with ICE, going, to Central America, telling people do not come. Right, but then we also tend to forget, like Obama, right? He had the highest number of deportations. My brother was deported during his administration, right? Biden has his own record of like deportation. There's just so many things, but one of the things that I would advise is to remember that we put them where they are and we have to hold them accountable for what they say, right? Remind them, like intern for them, like work for them and hold them accountable. Like you don't necessarily have to protest because that can become very exhausting, like on your soul, on your spirit. And if that's a way that like you don't want to engage, totally valid and totally understandable, but you can also call them, you can also send them emails, send them letters, contact them and remind them that because of your vote, they are where they are. So if she were to be elected, fingers crossed, trying to be by person or whatever, not really. I don't like very much. But you know, if she were to be elected, remind her that we placed her there.
Very good. So a couple of different approaches, but yes, that's great.
And we just have one question from our colleagues online, and this will need to be our last question of the evening. But the participant was asking about what the Democrats have to say on the issue of abortion, expressing concern for life that begins at conception to natural death. This Catholic notion of the seamless garment. So she's essentially asking sort of how to balance those issues, abortion alongside immigration and the others that have been mentioned this evening.
Oh, I am passing this to Brad.
I figured I was gonna end up with this one. I mean that this is one of the things that I think is helpful to remember is the difference between morality and politics, right? We might have very strong views on any of these issues, right? I have very strong views, as you've heard, about immigration issues, but how we work that out in the political arena is a different question. It's a related question, but it's a different question. And I think one of the things that unfortunately a lot of Catholics have gotten in their mind is they have equated their moral opposition to abortion with particular policies. But we legitimately ask the question of, are these the best policies to accomplish the moral end that we wish? I mean, one of the things that's, and there is data to help us ask these questions. You know, for Catholics that are very concerned about the abortion issue, you can say, well, how have abortions gone down, for example, since Roe v. Wade has been repealed? Well, the answer is they haven't. So there are lots of political questions that people can ask. And one of the things I think that does for Catholics is it maybe takes the pressure off having to think about a political race is about one issue. And you know, and I think that was part, you know, maybe I wouldn't have phrased it the way that Pope Francis did. You know, and I was also surprised, like, dude, you're commenting on the American election. I wasn't expecting that. But you know, but he was kind of like, you know, they both got a lot of stuff wrong. So, you know, so you got to figure it out.
Thanks, Brett. And so we're wrapping it. Did you have a final?
You don't want to say anything
Oh,
about
I'm sorry,
Catholic
you guys want
theology?
to- You were passing.
Those were great words to end on.
It's so hard, but what like Brett said, you know, this is an issue that even though it has been banned, it hasn't stopped. So at the end of the day, we have to remember that we have to protect one another. And so if abortions are not gonna stop, then can we at least make them offer them in a safe way, right? Because just as much as we care about the human beings being created, we should care about the person that is carrying those beings, right? And I think that's the best way I can put it, but yeah.
Thank you, Mariam.
I'll offer something very quick. And it's just something to keep in mind that banning abortions is not what stops abortions.
Yeah.
Things that stop abortions are comprehensive sexual education.
Yeah.
What stops abortion is access to healthcare.
Yeah.
On day one of Donald Trump's presidency, one of his first executive orders was to repeal the Affordable Health Care Act, as we understand it now. There are other ways, if we want to bring down the number of safe abortions, there are other ways to do that. Banning abortions doesn't stop abortions, it only stops safe abortions.
Thank you, Evan. My final comment before is that I'm very proud to call these people my colleagues here, and I'm proud to be a part of this community. Thank you all.
You're not alone in that, Ben. So two things. First, should you like to register to vote, you are welcome to do so at the table at the back. And second, our colleagues in the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination invite you to a screening of the animated documentary Home is Somewhere Else, followed by a panel discussion with Jose Garcia Moreno, Maria Barragan, and the film's director, Jorge Villalobos, on November 19th in the Life Sciences Building at 7 p.m. And I would like to close by thanking our moderator, our panelists, and all who have gathered to take part in this conversation, as well as those who have worked so hard to bring us together in dialogue this evening. Please join us for informal discussion over refreshments. Thank you for being here.
I watched the film and I was crying.
It's really good.
Oh my God. No.